The business card left in my mailbox was unassuming, a simple white font affixed to a black background, but its claim was bold. There is now an in-dream hotline you can call to escape nightmares. Simply find a red rotary phone in your dreamscape, dislocate it from the receiver, and choose a number to be connected. A good night's sleep is just around the corner. Enjoy your rest. It had all the markings of a half-hearted prank from my friend Josh. After all, he was the only person I had told about my recent night terrors. But stooping that low, just for a cheap laugh? He knew my nightmares were deeply personal, all involving my deceased father. Would he really go that far? Though Josh was a funny guy, he could be sentimental when the time called for it. I wondered if this was less of a prank and more an offering of relief during a tough time. His way of telling me there would eventually be a way out, a light at the end of the tunnel. I took comfort in this, opting not to reach out in case he decided to go back on it and laugh in my face. However caring the man could be, he detested heart-to-heart moments. Thanks, Josh. I guess I needed this. With a slight smile, I placed the card in my pocket and went about my day, grateful for the gesture. Unfortunately, it would not be enough to keep my demons at bay. Later that night, while resting, I was blindsided by memories of my father. Completely out of my control, a horrific scene came into focus, replaying the events of his death. I had no choice but to endure the torment and watch the events unfold in my mind, just as they had so many times before. I was a child, and we were swimming at our favorite spot on the outskirts of town. We often played a game to see who could hold their breath underwater the longest. On my father's last dip beneath the waves, he never came up for air. His body was never found. Being young and naive, I was convinced a creature came and dragged him into the depths of the ocean. As an adult, I now know the monster was a riptide, pulling him out into uncharted waters. Undercurrents in that area were fierce, eventually leading local authorities to close off the beach altogether. The search party never stood a chance of finding him. I violently thrashed about as the horrible images reoccurred, but soon found solace in the form of sleep. Like the many nights that came before it, this solace would be short-lived. My dream began as it usually did. I watched from the shadows as my dad tucked in my younger self and read aloud a bedtime story. This moment was always so peaceful, a calm before the storm. I briefly basked in the ambient nostalgia before remembering the event that would inevitably come next. That's when the panic set in. After the story concluded, my father transformed into something horrific. Below his waist was now a grouping of slimy tentacles, wetting the floor as he slid across it. Above his collar were the grotesque features of a monstrous head, an amphibious amalgamation of loose appendages, sharp teeth, and gills protruding from his neck. His mouth opened at an unnatural angle, wide enough for it to devour my younger self whole. He then turned his attention to me. This was my cue to run. Racing through the house to escape the creature's clutches, I felt something fall from my shirt pocket. It was the in-dream hotline business card. I picked it up and looked it over. Despite the fragile nature of visual stimuli in my dreams, the card was identical to its real counterpart. No matter how many times I read the text, none of the characters were fuzzy, jumbled, or rearranged. A thunderous growl crept behind me. I sprinted to the living room. That's where I saw it, right where my family's landline usually sat. A red rotary phone. In this moment, a compulsion washed over me. Despite the service being a complete fabrication, I was compelled to give it a try, if for no other reason than to see what would happen when I did. Perhaps my sleeping mind would fill in the blanks and wake me up from this nightmare. I picked up the phone from the receiver and held it to my ear. There was a harrowing silence. Going over the card again, I realized it was time to pick a number. It seemed there were only 5 viable choices. Numbers 6 through 0 had been scuffed away, along with the pound and star keys. When placing my finger in these holes, the wheel wouldn't budge. I instead decided to choose number 1. The wheel turned, and my ear was met with a male voice. "Thank you for calling the in-dream hotline for escaping nightmares. How can we be of service?" It worked. My brain was playing along. Hello, yes. I need to escape this nightmare, please, and quickly." "Certainly, I'd be happy to assist you with this. Please hold while we look up your situation." The sound of grinding teeth echoed in the distance as the creature slid from room to room, searching for me. "Oh boy, childhood trauma mixed with a phobia of sea monsters. That does not sound like fun. Luckily, this is an issue we're equipped to deal with. You have 3 options: transport, reconfigure, and vanquish. Which would you like?" The monster had now honed in on my position, slithering towards me as my eyes wandered in terror. Vanquish! Get rid of this thing!" "Okay, just one moment." I watched in horror as the creature closed the gap between us in a matter of seconds. "It looks like your account is new. You don't have the options to reconfigure or vanquish yet. All we can do is transport. Shall I initiate this option for you?" The eldritch version of my father swung its tentacles over me, narrowly missing my head as I cowered in fear. "Fine, transport! Do it now!" "One transport coming right up." All at once, the sound of grinding teeth stopped. The moisture of the floor evaporated. The creature was frozen in place, a statue of pure dread. It then vanished before my very eyes. "Transport successful. Thank you for calling the in-dream hotline. Enjoy your rest." It worked. I couldn't believe it. It's difficult to explain, but I felt alleviated. A wave of relief so strong it allowed me to breathe again. Catharsis filled the air as I walked through the dream version of my childhood home, free of the guilt I had harbored for so many years. My nightmare was finally over. I slept through the night and awoke fully refreshed, knowing that somehow I had come to terms with my father's death, albeit through some strange means. Sunlight poured into the room as the bird outside sang a beautiful melody, the smell of home-cooked food wafting through my apartment. But I live alone. Upon venturing out to the kitchen to identify the source of the aroma, I was taken aback by what I saw. It was my dad, cooking a seafood feast fit for a family of 12. "Hey there, sport. How was your nap?" My mouth hit the floor. "Dad? But how?" He smiled. "What's wrong, sport? You look like you've seen a ghost." Dumbstruck and frightened, I ran into my bedroom and locked the door. That was not my father. It couldn't be. He was swept out to sea. No one could have survived out there. It just wasn't possible. My phone buzzed, interrupting my panic. It was a private number. I hesitantly answered. "Hello, this is the in-dream hotline for escaping nightmares. We don't usually make calls outside of the dream void, but we notice your recent transport has went a little awry, and we're here to help." "What? Josh, is that you? What's going on? Is this some sort of sick joke?" "Transports can be unpredictable. We apologize for the inconvenience. If you upgrade to one of our premium packages, we can aid you in the removal of your nightmare. We accept all major credit cards." Did my ears deceive me? Was the in-dream hotline even real? The silver package is our cheapest upgrade, allowing you to reconfigure your nightmare, but there is no guarantee the results will be any better. We suggest you purchase our gold package, an option which lets you vanquish the nightmare once and for all. A stream of seawater entered the room as a familiar tentacle snuck beneath the doorframe. "Lunch is ready, sport. I hope you're hungry. I know I am. I handed over my credit card information without so much as a second thought. I'll take the gold package, please. Brilliant. Please hold. The sound of tapping at a keyboard filled my ear as my father began banging at the door. Your transaction is in transit. It will take 5 to 7 business days to process, at which time your nightmare will be vanquished. 5 to 7 days? Were they serious? I have to wait that long? What am I supposed to do in the meantime? Thank you for calling the In-Dream Hotline for Escaping Nightmares. We sincerely hope you live long enough to continue doing business with us. The operator paused before offering a final statement. This time, the friendly facade was over. Their voice was now stern and serious, with what felt like a tinge of malevolence. Good luck. I was just a kid. I didn't know any better. Even if I could go back, what would I have done differently? Could I have changed what happened? Could I have done anything at all? Probably not. Even so, I can't help but dwell on the details. Some nights, it keeps me from sleeping. I can only hope that sharing my tale will help ease the burden. I don't remember much about my childhood before my mother passed away. My dad told me that she was struck by a car on her way to work. I was only 4 years old. Still, I know that I loved her. Part of me still does. It's a strange, lingering feeling that doesn't go away. As much as I loved her, I feel that my father loved her even more. I say this because my mother's death took an immense toll on him. Up until I was about 10 years of age, he would have a nervous breakdown, tears and all, at least once a month. He never told me why, but I knew it was because of her. Things changed a bit my 10th year. We moved out of that house, the one that reminded us of her. My dad pulled me out of the school system, and we moved into a cabin out in the middle of nowhere. It may seem a bit drastic, but it was clear that my father needed a change. He wasn't doing so well. Because of this, I didn't question his actions. From that point on, we lived a simple life. My dad took odd jobs here and there, and seeing as we lived up north, selling firewood was sufficient enough to supplement our income. That was my job. I would go out each morning with my dad's old axe and chop some wood logs for our eager customers. It wasn't much of a life, but it was good enough for us. Comfortable with our new living situation, I was taken completely off guard one night when I heard the sound of crying coming from my father's room. We had been doing so well, so why was he still in such dire straits? Before I could analyze the situation any further, I heard my dad get up and slam the door shut on his way out of the cabin. I was compelled to follow him. Peering out of the cabin's entrance, I saw my dad storm off into the woods, bringing with him an acoustic guitar. I'd seen the guitar before, and I knew my dad used to play, but I'd never seen him handle the thing. I figured that those years were behind him. Curious as to what he was up to, I followed him into the forest. I tiptoed, making sure to hide behind trees and avoid stepping on leaves as I went. Eventually, we came to a small clearing with a creek running through it. Near the creek was a stump, where my dad sat down and adjusted until he was comfortable. He looked down at his guitar, closed his eyes, and began playing. I stood in awe of what I was hearing, a haunting mixture of melodious vocals and the rustling of the trees in the wind filled the forest. I knew he played, but I never knew he could sing. It was breathtaking, for lack of a better word. This went on as often as my dad had breakdowns in our previous house. Each night it happened, I would follow my dad out to the woods and listen to the beautiful song he'd seemingly written. I don't know what it meant, but I can tell even at age 10 that it stemmed from a place of great pain. I could tell that somber, heartfelt tune was about losing a loved one. Whenever I tried to picture my mother, the image was always blurry and out of focus, almost as if what little memory I had of her was slipping away. Whenever my dad played his song, I could picture her crystal clear. It was the oddest thing. This brought me comfort and ultimately helped me come to terms with her death. I had hoped at the time that it was doing the same for him. Being 10 years old, though, it was hard to tell what was going through an adult's mind. Many months passed. The routine was nice for a while, but one night, everything changed. I heard the usual swing of the cabin door, followed by a swift crack against the door frame. It was very loud, signaling for me that my father was more distressed than usual. I hastily made my way to the door in an effort to follow him, but I stopped for a moment when passing his bedroom. The door was open just enough for me to see the guitar leaning up against his bed. How peculiar. I wondered why he left it behind. In truth, there was only one way to find out. My dad was already at the creek when I arrived. He sat on the stump, motionless and quiet. He was in a sulking position, and his eyes were closed. Without his guitar or voice, the forest around him was void of sound. The only thing I could hear was the water in the creek as it trickled by us. Soon enough, my father began singing. I could tell it was the same song he'd always sung, but it sounded off. Without his guitar, his voice was muddy and out of tune. There were some awkward highs and lows that made my stomach hurt. Though his eyes were shut, I saw tears forcing their way out and watched as they swam down his cheeks. Eventually, he stopped singing and broke down crying. What happened in the following moments will stay with me forever. As my father wept, something strange happened. A milky white fog danced across the water. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but eventually, the white smoke gathered above the creek and took shape right before my very eyes. It was a spirit. No ordinary spirit, mind you. It was my mother. My father stopped crying and instead began shivering. He opened his eyes and looked up to see the specter. He almost fell backward in fear. The ghost of my mother reached out and began choking my father. His face went from red to blue before my mom stopped. He fell to the ground and vigorously gasped for air. I couldn't bring myself to lend a helping hand. I was stuck in a petrified state. My father tried to crawl away, but it was to no avail. My mother began clawing away at him. She tore through his clothes and eventually through his skin. I watched in horror as she reached into his body and ripped out his vital organs. His bones snapped like branches. His blood tainted the water. His voice once again filled the forest. Only now it was screams of agony. I couldn't bear to watch any longer, so I closed my eyes. With my eyes shut, I remembered the song my dad sang. I started humming it to myself, and just like that, I calmed down. The world around me became quiet. All I could think about was the song, that beautiful tune. Memories of my parents came through the floodgates as I hummed. Tears rolled down my cheeks. I couldn't help but break down. What had my childhood become? Where was I going to go from here? Eventually, I stopped humming and opened my eyes. The apparition of my mother was gone. My dad's open corpse lay on the stump where he used to sing. As the scene before me sunk in, so did my heart. It crawled into the pit of my stomach and made a nest. It would stay there for many years to come. I don't remember running back to the cabin, nor do I recall calling the local authorities. What I do remember is the look on their faces where they took me back out there to what I had seen. The sight of my father's body was a grisly one, that's for sure. It was unlike anything the town had ever witnessed. Still, it was taken care of in a swift and respectful fashion. In the coming months, the investigation came to an end. The true cause of my father's death was never determined, but that doesn't mean there were no answers found. My mother's body was discovered buried beneath the creek. My father's axe was determined to be the murder weapon. One of the theories floating around town was that my dad was the jealous type. They think he convinced himself my mom was having an affair, and then he lost his mind. Feeling guilty, he moved us out near the dump site so we could be closer to her. I guess I'll never know the full story, but one thing is for certain. My mother had her revenge. The iPad looked to be in pristine condition, almost as good as new except for a few scuff marks on the screen. Nothing seemed broken on it, and the picture showed it working perfectly. I knew as soon as I saw it that it had to be mine. Part of my brain told me that it was too good to be true. $40 for an iPad in mint condition? Something's going on here. But the cheapskate part of my brain won over, and eventually, I found myself setting up a meeting place for the purchase. Both me and the owner of the iPad agreed that the best place to meet up would be at his house. Since it was fairly close to my place, and there was no good place to rendezvous between my place and his. He did give me some bizarre instructions for when I arrived at his house. His email told me to grab the iPad off the porch and slip the money under his doormat. When I attempted to ask him why he couldn't just come out and talk to me, he didn't respond. I should probably have had more doubts about the whole arrangement after that, but I was so blinded by such a good deal that I didn't bother asking any more questions. Soon enough, it came time to make the purchase. I drove 15 minutes to his house, which was in a decent enough neighborhood. The lawns were trimmed and the houses looked clean and well cared for. As soon as I pulled into his driveway, however, I could tell that my new business partner's home was the exception. There were weeds growing throughout the cracks in the sidewalk, and the front porch was covered in random junk, like chairs, radios, and other assorted novelties. I wondered why the HOA wasn't on his case by now. As I neared the door, I noticed a putrid smell coming from inside. Resting upon the welcome mat was the glorious box that apparently held my new device. I pulled the $40 out of my pocket and slid the cash under the mat. Before I left, I called out, "Thank you." Then, I booked it out of there and back to my house. The house just gave me a bad feeling, like something bad had happened, or was about to happen there. As I was sitting down in the living room getting ready to open up the cardboard box that stored the device, I noticed some words scrawled in large lettering on the bottom that I hadn't seen when I picked it up. "Check the Notes app," they read in giant messy handwriting. I was extremely confused by this, but I decided to put the red flags on hold in my mind as I pulled out the iPad. It looked just like the pictures had shown. It was in great working order and only had a few marks on the screen. I turned it on and swiped up to unlock it. I noticed right away that the device had apparently not been factory reset. The wallpaper was customized to a picture of an enormous black lab, and there were a number of apps downloaded that I was certain were not the default iOS apps. I was about to go to the settings to reset the iPad when I remembered the words on the box. I decided, just for the fun of it, to check the Notes app. It probably was just a joke the original owner was trying to pull on me, but I decided to play along. I swiped over to the first screen with all of the default apps, like photos and maps, and I tapped on notes. Immediately I saw that there were 3 notes. The timestamps on each of them showed that they had been written around the same time, about an hour before I had arrived at the iPad owner's house. I decided to read the notes in chronological order, from the times that they were written. This is an exact transcript of what they said. June 12th, 2021, 12:17 p.m. I need to tell this to someone. I know that no one will believe me, and I'm not sure what good it'll be if you do. I'm too far gone by now anyway. I should probably start at the beginning. I was living a decently normal life. I spent most of my time at home with my dog Lacey, which you probably saw as my wallpaper. I worked from home and was perfectly happy. However, one day, I began to feel extremely odd. My ears would pop randomly and my mouth would dry up. As I was working, I found it harder and harder to concentrate on what I was doing. I'm a very focused person, so this is abnormal for me. My mind would wander to random things and I would lose my train of thought. I didn't think much of all this because I figured I would feel better the next day. But as the hours passed, the symptoms would get worse and I began to feel a headache. I went to sleep, hoping that the rest would make it better. But the next day, my headache had morphed into a pounding migraine. At times, the pain would subside, but after an hour or so, the pain would always come back stronger. This went on for several days. I set up appointments with various doctors who each put me on some generic painkillers. None of the meds ever worked, and I was beginning to get desperate. I started vomiting frequently, and after a week, my vomit began to be mixed with blood. My sickness was progressing quickly, but no doctor or specialist could pinpoint a cause or a solution. All they ever did was give me a prescription for some drug that never did me any good. A few weeks into my illness, I began noticing some bizarre things in and around my house. I occasionally heard footsteps in the night, shuffling along the floor outside my bedroom. Once or twice, I heard a raspy voice echoing from a nearby room. At first, I attributed these weird happenings to my sickness and ignored them. They still unnerved me, but I didn't lend them much thought. All that I was concerned with was finding a cure. I couldn't think of any way that I could have contracted the disease. I hadn't traveled in a long time and I usually keep to myself. I wasn't able to work because of my symptoms, and my life was miserable. I just wanted a way out. That was the end of the first note. I was somewhat confused, but I was also intrigued to see what happened next. I was still sure that it was a prank, albeit a well-written one. I tapped on the next note, wondering what happened in the next issue of this strange series of notes. June 12th, 2021, 12:38 p.m. Like I said, I didn't think much about the voices or the footsteps. I tried my best to ignore them, and eventually they just blended in with all my other miseries. They just became another obstacle preventing me from falling asleep at night. Unfortunately, the sounds only got worse. The footsteps got louder and louder, and the voices became more and more frequent. The voice was raspy, but I couldn't tell if it belonged to a male or female, or if it belonged to someone old or someone young. It was an unidentifiable voice. The voice would say very strange things. I couldn't understand half of its words, but what I could make out disturbed me. It told me that I was worthless. It said that my life only existed as a sacrifice, and that I should just give up. It said that it was always watching me, and that it was waiting for the right moment. What the right moment was, I may never know. I started to call my doctors and told them that I was experiencing auditory hallucinations, but they still couldn't help me. I even talked to a psychiatrist who provided just as much assistance as everyone else I had consulted. Late on Friday night, I was laying in my bed trying not to vomit when I heard a noise come from outside my room. It sounded like glass shattering. I hadn't heard the voices or footsteps that night so far, but I figured it was just a hallucination. For some reason, however, I felt the strong compulsion to check. I was sure that the noise had come from my den, so I crawled out of bed just to look. It took me a while to get there. I was moving slowly and quietly, because a part of me thought that this could have been a burglary. I couldn't hear anything out of the ordinary, so I continued on. Eventually, I arrived in the den. What I saw shook me to my very core. There was my vase, which had been sitting on top of my end table mere hours ago, laying shattered on the wooden floor. I also knew for a fact that it couldn't have fallen off on its own, because I had placed it as close to the wall as I could in order to keep it secure. I called the police, but nothing came of their investigation. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing had been stolen or moved besides the vase. After that, I was paranoid. The voices kept coming back. Sometimes, I saw things move on their own accord, just slightly, as if they had been nudged by the wind. I knew that couldn't be the case, however, since my windows were always closed and my air conditioner had been broken at the time. The illness was still increasing in severity, and I thought I was going crazy. My life was miserable. It had been over a month since my sickness started, and things were only getting worse. I considered taking my own life, but I still held on to some small hope that things would get better. Soon enough, I started seeing things. At least, that's what I thought. At first, I was walking down my hall to the bathroom when I saw someone's back around the corner at the end of the hall. I ran after them, but they were gone. The corner rounds off into my kitchen, and there was no sign of the person there. Similar things started happening after that. I'd walk into my room to see someone jumping out of my window, or I would see someone slam the door to a closet as I walked past. When I'd investigate these appearances, whoever it was would vanish. I could never get a good look at the person. They seemed to be short, but I couldn't really tell, and they were always wearing white. I was fully certain that these were hallucinations. I didn't want to believe that I was going insane, but that was the only logical conclusion. I decided to try and photograph these incidents with my iPad. I would keep it in my hands at all times, and every time I saw something strange moving or someone walk around, I would snap a picture. None of these photos ever turned out. I still have them saved on the device you're reading this on. They look completely normal, like pictures of my hall or bedroom. I was living in a nightmare. I was going completely insane. That was the end of the second note. By now, I was very unnerved. If this whole story was true, then why was the guy telling me this? It seemed a bit too bizarre to be real, but I decided to finish reading before making any judgments. I flicked over to the third and final note and began reading the final chapter of this strange series. I don't have much time, but I need to finish my story. I had given up all hope of photographing the sightings. Instead, I did my best to ignore them. In fact, I gave up hope in general. I knew that there wasn't much hope of me getting better. I had to quit my job because I was still sick and couldn't work. I was neglecting my poor dog Lacey. By now I was resigned to my fate. I was sure I would die soon. I'm only writing this out because of what I saw yesterday. I had woken up in the dead hours of the night. My mouth was parched, and I decided to grab a glass of water from the kitchen. I crawled out of my bed, using my iPad screen as a light to find my way. As I stumbled groggily along, I began feeling very sick. I tried to hold back the urge to vomit and pushed on. As I was nearing the corner that turns off into the kitchen, I heard a sound coming from inside. It sounded like a raspy laugh or giggle. I shuddered, but I chalked it up to my hallucinations and entered the room. As soon as I stepped over the threshold into my kitchen, my heart dropped down into my stomach. I pulled up the iPad and took a picture of it, and this time, it finally turned out. I'm not totally crazy. You can see it for yourself. I think I'm being haunted. My hope is that by telling someone else, by sharing my experience, I'll have freed myself. I'm sorry if the ghosts have passed on to you. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. If they stay here with me, then at least someone else will know what happened to me. Once the sickness begins, there is no escape. Unfortunately, I feel that I'm too far gone anyway, but I still have hope. That was the end of the guy's notes. I was extremely confused, and I had no idea what to think. This had to be fake. Just this guy trolling me. But I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt and check the Photos app, just to see what this mystery picture was. I left the notes and tapped on Photos. The gallery was filled with random pictures of doors, open windows, and hallways. These were presumably the pictures the original owner of the iPad took when he saw those hallucinations. There was nothing abnormal about them. But the last picture was the terrifying one. The sight has given me nightmares. The picture shows a kitchen, with the camera pointing at the fridge. The photo had clearly been taken with the flash turned on, as it showed the body of a girl lit up with artificial light. The girl was wearing a flowing white dress with lace on the collar. She was unnaturally pale, and her hair was jet black. In the girl's hand, the girl was holding a small cloth doll that looked like an exact replica of her with the same clothes, hair, and eyes. These eyes were definitely the creepiest part of the whole photograph. Her pupils weren't black, they were red, and they were staring straight at the camera. Needless to say, I factory reset the device that very day. I couldn't shake the sight of that girl. Every time I close my eyes, I see her staring into my soul. It's a horrible feeling. I decided that the entire story was a prank. The original owner of the iPad had written that whole story and photoshopped the picture just to scare me. I tried to go on about my life normally, but unfortunately, I think the man was telling the truth, and I think his plan worked, because I've recently started feeling very sick, and the usual meds won't cure it. I'm having trouble focusing. I've needed to take the last few days off of work. And what's worse, factory resetting the iPad didn't work, because the picture of the little girl sitting on top of the fridge is still saved on the device. I have no idea what to do. Should I sell the tablet on Craigslist like the man did before it's too late? Or do I keep it here until I die, hoping that the ghosts die with me? I hope someone out there knows what to do. I'm running out of options. Everyone knows the story of Bloody Mary, and everyone knows how to summon her. Say her name 3 times in front of a mirror with the lights off. Of course, there are slight variations to the exact story depending on where you live, but it's all basically the same, right? My school was no different. A bunch of us kids in the 7th grade would gather up in the bathroom at least once a week, turn off the lights, and say her name 3 times. Of course nothing happened, but I always kept my eyes squeezed closed, so even if something did happen, I wouldn't have seen it. We were a bit morbid, thinking back on it. I knew that it wouldn't work, but I also knew that we shouldn't be tempting fate. The urban legend states that she would kill you or scratch your eyes out, so why exactly would we have even wanted to try to summon her? I guess kids do stupid things when they're young, but that's no excuse for how far it went. Like I said, it started with a bunch of us in the 7th grade doing the ritual in the bathroom closet to our 4th period class. The 6 of us had all met in 4th period at the beginning of the year, and since 4th period was right before lunch, we would all slip away and do our ritual without being bothered. Bloody Mary, or Mary as we begin to call her, became almost like a long-lost friend of ours. I don't think that my friends knew that I kept my eyes closed, though, and I wasn't about to tell them that it was possibly my fault that none of this was working. Nothing happened over the span of a few months. No Mary appearance, although we tried a bunch of variations. At least, until the day that the somewhat leader of our little group, Cassie, ran up to meet me in a huff outside before school started. "Hey, Nikki, I found a real way to get Mary to appear. I've already told the others, but we've got to meet at the outside bathroom by the Pavilions to make it work." I tried to question, to protest, but the bell had rung and she was already walking away. "Just meet us there, okay?" she called over her shoulder. The bathroom by the Pavilions was the worst. It wasn't connected to the main school building, so it had no AC and, even worse, no inside lights. The light was provided only by a single flickering bulb and small grates that allowed the sunlight to filter in. And to top it off, the whole place smelled like a porta potty. The outside bathroom was truly awful. But I did as I was told and met the girls right after the bell rang for lunch. Instead of turning the light off immediately, though, Cassie gathered us up in front of the row of sinks, gesturing to the middle sink in the row of 5. She said, "I finally figured it out. My brother's girlfriend came over the other night, and she said that she and her friends were able to see Mary here." "And she lived? Why here instead of any other mirror? What did she say happened?" Bethany, Nia, and Erica all spoke at once, and Cassie waved a dismissive hand. She didn't go into so much detail, because my parents were out and she was going into my brother's room. But she said that we first have to acknowledge Mary's baby, and then it'll work. "Mary's baby?" I asked, not quite understanding, but definitely not wanting anything to do with the ghost baby. "Yeah, that's what she said. It'll take a few days, but she said it'll work for sure." "Okay, how do we do it then?" Nia chimed in from the back. I was already somewhat apprehensive, being in the very isolated and very creepy outside bathroom, but I felt my stomach immediately drop when Cassie said, "First, we have to summon Mary's baby." My body wanted to instantly flee, and I wished that I had trusted my instincts. Instead, I stayed silent and let Nia ask, "Wait, I thought that Mary killed her babies, didn't she?" "Well, yeah, but in death she still wants them, I guess." "Okay, so how do we do this baby thing, and why do we have to do it here?" Erica asked, her nose scrunching up at the smell. Cassie sighed and said, "I don't know. Tyler's girlfriend said something about the baby being born prematurely, and being stuffed down this sink without anyone knowing." Bethany opened her mouth to say something, but Cassie continued, "I know, okay? I know it sounds dumb, but she said it worked, and what we've been doing hasn't, so we can at least try it, right?" We all shrugged in agreement, and after looking at each of us directly, Cassie began again. Okay, so first, we have to have the water on, cold water only. She turned on the tap, then pointed at Bethany, who was closest to the door. Then lock the door and turn the light off. When Bethany did so, Cassie instructed us all to gather in front of the dirty mirror above the running middle sink. Okay, now hold your arms like you're holding a little baby. Look straight into the mirror and rock your arms back and forth while I say the words. We should feel a weight in our arms, and then we have to release it over the sink like Mary did. Are you guys ready? She looked at our glared reflections in the mirror, gave a nod in response to our own nods, and began to recite. Baby blue, your mommy's gone away. Baby blue, please come here to stay. Baby blue, we'll care for you. We're sorry your mommy could not. Baby blue, please come to us. We promise that you won't rot. Baby blue, your mommy's gone, but we will heal your pain. Baby blue, please come to us. Your mommy is insane. The rhyme itself was disturbing, but even worse was the squeal that rang out from the faucet almost as soon as Cassie had finished reciting. Surely it was the sound of a whining pipe, but it sounded sort of like a baby crying. Now, Cassie yelled, and we all released our arms and bolted toward the door. Once safely outside, Cassie looked at us and grinned. I think it worked. We have to do this again every day for a week or so, but I think it worked. We all looked at each other, unsure if we had all experienced the same thing, and then Bethany spoke up. What was that sound? Was it the baby or was it the pipes? Cassie shrugged. I don't know, but once we finish this, it's really going to work. Let's meet here at the same time tomorrow. With that, she turned and began walking to the cafeteria, and we all slowly followed. The next day, we all met at the outside bathroom again at the same time. This time, when Cassie turned on the faucet, the squealing began immediately. It truly sounded like a baby crying, and I was freaked out immediately. But Cassie shut down my objections and told Bethany to lock the door and to turn off the light. As soon as the lights were off, I squeezed my eyes shut. Cassie recited her poem, and I tried my best to block out the sound of that squealing water faucet. What I couldn't brush off, though, was the weight that I had felt suddenly placed in my cradled arms. When Cassie said, "Now," I was the first to the door. I tried to ask the other girls about it later, but none of them would honestly answer whether or not the pipe sounded like a crying baby, or if any of them had felt the weight in their arms. We repeated this for the next few days, but I no longer cradled my arms. I may have imagined it, but I didn't want to feel that weight again. After Friday's ritual, Cassie grinned at us all and said, Monday should be the final one. We'll finally see Mary. We all talked over the phone during the weekend, but Erica was the only one who felt anything similar to the apprehension that I did. She didn't tell the others though, only me. So, when Monday came around, I guessed that I wasn't the only one feeling the growing dread in the pit of my stomach. The clock ticked by, and the anxiety grew worse, until it was finally time. I felt like I was going to vomit. We all met up at the bathroom and followed Cassie in. Her confidence seemed to spread throughout us, and while it did help a bit, I felt like the other girls had gotten the majority of it. I still ended up in front of that mirror, terrified. Cassie turned the sink on, and I didn't even wait for Bethany to turn the lights off before I closed my eyes. The sound of the baby crying began almost at the same time that Cassie began to recite the poem. Baby blue, baby blue, your mommy's gone away. Baby blue, please come here to stay. Baby blue, we'll care for you. We're sorry your mommy could not. Baby blue, please come to us. We promise that you won't rot. Baby blue, your mommy's gone, but we will heal your pain. Baby blue, please come to us. Your mommy is insane. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room in an instant, and I fought to breathe through the hot thickness. I heard someone whimper softly. Erica, maybe, but I refused to open my eyes, so I couldn't be sure. I stood completely motionless, Cassie and Nia on my left, Bethany and Erica on my right. The events that followed are something that I only allow myself to think of in my darkest moments, but will always be imprinted in my mind. Drop the baby, Cassie yelled at the same time that someone on my right began to scream. Shortly afterwards, someone else, I think Nia, began to scream as well. Drop the baby, now, Cassie yelled out again, and through the screams I heard a new sound. It sounded like ripping up an old t-shirt, but as if the fabric was wet. No, someone yelled, and then there was a new sound, a bubbling, gurgling, wet noise. I wrapped my arms around myself and took a step back away from the other girls. The ripping sound was coming faster, and the cry of the baby was becoming more shrill. Mary? I heard Cassie mutter, followed by another scream. My eyes! Someone on my right yelled out, and I couldn't take it anymore. I raced towards the bathroom door, blindly running my hands against it to find the deadbolt. There was a horrible wet snarling sound behind me, and I had just touched my fingers against the cold metal of the lock when I felt something grab me by my shoulder, sending a searing pain down my arm before I felt my body being thrown backwards. I must have hit my head, because I passed out soon afterwards. I woke up in the hospital with my parents by my side. We were soon joined by police officers who wanted to talk to me about what happened. She's been unconscious for 5 days, and she's obviously been traumatized. Can't this wait? Sir, I understand that this is troubling, but how would you feel if you were the father of one of the other girls? Please, sir. She may be able to provide crucial answers to all of this. My father stepped aside with a sigh and let one of the officers approach my hospital bed. Hi, Nikki, he said with a soft smile. I need to ask you some questions about what went on in the bathroom, about what happened with you and your friends. Do you think you can do that favor for me? I nodded slightly before asking, did something happen to my friends? Are they okay? The officer's eyes briefly darted away from me and I continued. You aren't going to believe me when I tell you, and I didn't see anything anyways, because my eyes were kept shut the entire time. I truly didn't see anything. I promise. I only heard things. The warm smile continued and he said, It's okay, Nikki. Just tell me everything you heard then. I told him the entire story, about Mary and our ritual, and as I went on, my parents' faces became more horrified. I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. But mostly I was scared of what may have happened to Cassie and the others. When I had finished describing everything, I asked the officer about my friends. He apologized and said that he wasn't allowed to discuss it with me. The cops left the room, so I asked my parents the same question, and it caused my mom to break out in tears. I ended up not finding anything out until a few weeks later. when I was checked into an inpatient mental health facility for a mandatory stay for at least 90 days. I had no idea what was going on, but I saw a therapist daily to discuss what went on in the bathroom. After the first few days of me repeating the details over and over during our long session, the therapist finally began to discuss what happened with me. Some of my friends had been hurt that day. One of them had died. My therapist wanted me to name which friend had done this to the rest of us, citing my horribly bruised shoulder as proof that someone physically in the bathroom had done this. She wouldn't accept my explanation of Mary. I'm not sure why she thought it was Cassie. Little by little, my therapist slipped the details. I'm sorry, Nikki, but I just can't accept that something supernatural attacked you and your friends. How then could you explain Bethany being blinded but not the others? How could Erica's cheek be mutilated at nearly the same time? Do you believe that a supernatural being attacked all of you at the same time, but with different attacks? All within just a few minutes? How could that be possible? I had no answer. During another session, how then could Bethany be murdered directly beside all of you, if the same entity was attacking both Erica and Bethany? Are you sure that you didn't see anything at all? And another. Nikki, Nia was standing on the farthest left side, right next to Cassie. Her body was cut open in ribbons. You had your eyes closed the entire time. As you've said many times, you only recall Cassie saying things related to Bloody Mary and the ritual, as you call it. Would it be possible that Cassie could have moved without you knowing? Say to your right where Bethany was? Is it possible that Cassie had something sharp, like a pair of scissors? Something to cut both Nia and Bethany? The therapist refused to acknowledge anything that I said. She insisted that I must have been confused, hearing Cassie's voice on the left and Bethany's voice on the right at the same time. She said I must have been mistaken when I heard the growling, the snarling, the terrified voices of my friends as I fumbled to find the lock on the bathroom door. That I must have seen something and couldn't possibly have kept my eyes shut the entire time. The therapist was an idiot. I continued to tell the truth, and after 90 days I was allowed to go home. I had missed Nia's funeral, and I soon found out that Bethany and Erica were leaving the state, while Cassie had been charged and confined to a psychiatric hospital for Nia's death. My parents chose to homeschool me. It's been 10 years and I try not to think about any of this. In fact, I was able to forget about it for a few years. I was able to live my life normally, albeit avoiding mirrors as much as possible. Just living my life and getting by. Until Cassie called me a few days ago. I don't even know how she found my number, but she left a few voicemails now and hasn't stopped calling. I listened to one voicemail, heard what she wanted, and now I'm trying to convince myself that I want nothing to do with any of it. She has a plan set, and I don't want to be involved. I don't. However, I have to admit that I have been slightly fantasizing about us all going back and doing the ritual, this time with video evidence. I've always wanted to call Bethany and Erica to ask them what they saw, but I never had the courage. Some part of me truly wants to know what actually happened that day. Some part of me wants to try again and keep my eyes open this time, but I truly don't think I'd go through that again. Maybe. The sleeping mind fascinates me, namely the nighttime hallucinations we call dreams. Because of this, I keep a journal to record every thought that passes through my brain at night. I set at least one alarm each day so that I'm able to wake up during REM cycles and recall my grandest dreams. Sometimes I fall back asleep, but for the most part, I keep up with it. It's been an enlightening experience, and so far, I've filled a dozen notebooks with my nightly adventures. In addition to cataloging my dreams, I study the phenomenon. I've dissected every sleep guide at my disposal and watched countless documentaries. I even took an elective back in high school called Nocturnal Fantasies. Though it only lasted a semester, not enough students shared my affinity for the topic. In other words, most of my waking life is consumed by sleep, in one form or another. Craving more knowledge on the subject, I recently pursued my town library's massive local authors section. I was hoping to find a book on dreams I hadn't read, as this was one part of the library I had yet to set foot in. It was a long shot, but one I was willing to take in the name of research. After fishing through a plethora of self-published romance novels, I happened across one fiction title that caught my eye. Sleep Tactics, Exercises for a Mind at Rest, written by Jack Grovewood. The blurb on the back was vague and reminiscent of a self-help book with quotes like, "Learn the secrets to a good night's rest," and "Feed your mind's insatiable appetite for better understanding." Not a book on dreams per se, but it did pique my interest. Delving into the book at home, I found it to be more up my alley than I previously expected. It was filled with chapters pertaining to lucid dreaming, meditation, and even sleepwalking. I was already familiar with most of the content, but it turned out to be an enjoyable read. It wasn't until the last chapter, though, that I was caught completely off guard. I will outline most of it below. Chapter 16, How to Exit Your Body. Disclaimer: this is not an OBE, or out-of-body experience. As stated in Chapter 8, Out of Body, Out of Bed, I do believe in OBEs, but I find that they're just another form of dreaming. What I'm about to divulge to you is something completely different. It's neither an OBE nor any other dream state. This is a way to truly exit your body using sleep paralysis as the catalyst. Before I discuss specifics, I'd like to go over a few prerequisites. To pull this off, you must be proficient at lucid dreaming. What I mean by this is that you need to have lucid dreams regularly and retain lucidity for long periods of times in these dreams. It also helps if you're able to manipulate your dream environment with ease. If you only lucid dream on occasion, you'll have to train your mind to do so more often. See Chapter 6, Becoming a Lucid Lucy. If you, however, are unable to lucid dream, then this technique is not for you. It's nothing personal. You simply lack the tools needed for departure. Another requirement is sleep paralysis. Most of us have experienced this at one time or another, but it will help immensely if you experience it on a regular basis. Coupled with lucidity and a focused mind, sleep paralysis is the only way out of your own skin, so to speak. That's all you need in the way of mental capabilities, more or less. It's an added bonus if you've had an OBE or wake-initiated lucid dream. Now on to the fun part. I'm going to lay this out in a step-by-step fashion, followed by a more detailed explanation of what to expect upon achieving your first departure. Keep in mind that results may vary. Step 1. Fall asleep on your back in a slanted position. It could be a recliner or a car seat, but your body must be diagonal relative to the ground level. That's the only way I've ever been able to get this to work. For one reason or another, gravity plays a role. Step 2. Attain sleep paralysis. This is more of a waiting game than a step, as it's not entirely possible to execute at will. When it does happen, lucidity is key. You must be aware that you're in a state of sleep paralysis and be unafraid of your lack of mobility. This is one of the ways being a lucid dreamer comes in handy. Step 3. Once paralyzed, attempt to move your legs. If you're in the proper position, at least one of them should be mobile. If you can't move either leg, then you'll have to restart and experiment by tilting your seat in a different position. Step 4. Upon freeing one or more of your legs, attempt to free your arms. They will feel incredibly stiff, and you shouldn't be able to move them, try as you might. You should then feel a sharp sting in your head. Don't be alarmed. You're not having an aneurysm. This is completely normal and is necessary to make your exit. Step 5. As difficult and strenuous as it may be, keep trying to free your arms. As you do this, attempt to move the rest of your body as well. Put everything you have into fighting the paralysis. Just don't fall back asleep. Step 6. As you wrestle with your mind and body, the stinging sensation in your brain is going to grow. It won't be painful, but it will cause you great discomfort. Let it happen. As the sensation builds, you'll start to feel yourself drift away from your body. Don't fight it. Your mind is like a rubber band and will want to bounce back from where it is being stretched. Don't let it. Follow the flow of departure. If you still your mind's focus and follow these instructions to a T, you will have successfully exited your earthly meat sack and unlocked a marvel of the mind that has only begun to be understood. And that's the gist of it. The author went on to say that the world you find yourself in upon departure will harbor some differences to the one you started in. It'll appear similar in almost every way, but will be completely void of any life forms. On top of that, nothing will budge. Everything will remain in its place as still as it can be. After revealing the delicate process of re-entering one's body, the author ended the chapter with an eerie warning. Whatever you do, don't go near the water. I was dumbfounded. The entire book up to that point was factual, but that last chapter seemed like something out of a science fiction novel. It certainly made for good entertainment, but I couldn't make heads or tails of it. Why have such an out-of-place pseudoscience chapter in an otherwise reputable book? It just didn't make any sense. About a week passed before I thought about the book again. It was almost time to return it to the library, so I decided to reread its final chapter. As absurd as it seemed, I teetered between laughing it off once and for all and actually giving it a shot. I did meet all of the requirements, and it would amuse me to some small extent. I could, at the very least, say that I tried it for myself, if for no other reason than to prove it was a load of crap. After weighing the pros and cons, I ended up giving in to my curiosity. I knew it wasn't going to work, but it would be a fun little experiment if nothing else. Besides, was there really anything better for me to do during an episode of sleep paralysis? The only minor nuisance was that I'd have to sleep on one of my recliners instead of the comfort of my king-size Serta mattress. A small price to pay for the sake of scientific discovery. On the night in question, I wound up having 3 episodes of sleep paralysis. During the first, I was far too groggy. I completely forgot about the book and quickly fell back asleep. The second one lasted a bit longer, and I was able to remember the steps outlined in the last chapter. I could just barely move one of my legs, and upon trying my arms, I did feel a small but noticeable discomfort in my head. I wondered for a split second if the author was onto something, and that made me a bit excited. Because of this, I jolted awake. Reflecting on the incident, I became intrigued. I still didn't believe that I could exit my body, but I knew something was going on. I decided to tilt the recliner back a bit and try again. This time I would have better control. The next episode came pretty quick. I hadn't fallen asleep yet, but my body was getting ready to. This is it, I thought. I allowed the paralysis to fully set in before attempting anything. It was difficult not to fall asleep, but I managed. This time around, I was able to gain full control over my left leg. I moved it back and forth a few times before trying to free my arms. True to the method, they wouldn't budge, and I felt oddly stiff, more so than usual. This is when the familiar sting set in. It jarred me, but I kept going. The more I tried to move my arms, the greater the sting grew. Believe it or not, as I continued, I did in fact feel myself drifting away from my body. I tried to keep it up, but my nerves got the best of me. I lost all control for just a moment and was sucked right back into my body, immediately waking up in the process. This experience startled the hell out of me. It was beginning to seem more and more likely that the last chapter of Jack Grovewood's book was somehow accurate. My curiosity became aroused to such an extent that I felt the overwhelming need to tell somebody about it. Luckily, I knew just the person. My buddy Josh is a character. He believes in a lot of what I don't. This causes us to butt heads on a lot of topics. In simple terms, I'm a skeptic and he's a believer. One thing we can agree on, however, is our love for dreams. He's the only person I can talk to at length about the subject. He also happens to meet the requirements listed in the book. I was hoping he would join me for a sleep session and help me get to the bottom of what was going on. I called Josh up and told him everything. He was ecstatic and agreed to meet me at my place the following night for departure. In his mind, this was going to go off without a hitch. I wasn't completely sold on it yet. I was just happy to have someone else to tag along for the ride. Fast forward to the following night. We hung out for a bit and I showed Josh the book. His eyes grew wide upon reading the final chapter, and he couldn't wait to try it out himself. I told him not to get his hopes up, but it was clear to me that they already were. Ready as ever, we laid down at opposite ends of the living room on my two recliners. Josh cracked a joke about how this was the first night we'd be sleeping together. I threw a pillow at him, and then we were off. Shut-eye was just around the corner. This was when things took a turn for the bizarre. I didn't have an episode of sleep paralysis right away, but I did end up waking a few hours into my nap. I noticed that Josh was fast asleep in the recliner across the room. Needing to empty my bladder, I walked past him to get to the bathroom, tripping over his legs in the process. I met the floor with a thud and turned around to see if Josh had awoken. To my surprise, he hadn't. I knew he was a heavy sleeper, but he should have woken up, given the commotion. Becoming worried, I called out his name. No reaction. I tried shaking him. Nothing. I grabbed a wrist and checked his pulse. It was there, but it was weak. This was when I panicked. I ran to my room, grabbed my phone and scrambled to hit the call button. Just as I was about to dial 911, I heard a loud gasp from the next room, like a diver coming up for air. I ran out there as fast as I could, and to my delight, Josh was awake. He looked up at me with wide eyes and said, "Dude, it actually worked." I was flabbergasted. Though Josh was an over-enthusiastic believer and downright stubborn at times, he was no liar. I asked him more than once if he was sure it wasn't a dream, and he insisted that he was absolutely certain. Between his firm conviction and weak pulse just moments before, I had no choice but to believe him. It seemed that the book was legitimate after all. We spent the next couple of hours talking about it. After leaving his body, Josh found himself in my living room, but it was noticeably inanimate. Everything was perfectly still. Not even a speck of dust floating through the air. Josh also noticed that his body was translucent, a milky white outline of its former shape. He attempted to open the door to my house, but the knob wouldn't turn and the door wouldn't budge. It took him a while to realize this, but he found his new form allowed him to phase through walls. Josh went on to tell me that the world outside was very different from ours. He said it was like having the contrast dialed up on a picture. That and the static nature of everything made it feel like being trapped in a photograph. I tried to imagine it, but I knew I needed to see it for myself. We made plans to go back to sleep and enter the world together. Despite my excitement, I was able to make my first successful departure that night. Josh was waiting in the room for me, next to his sleeping body. Seeing ourselves like that was fascinating in and of itself, but I wanted more than anything to see the world outside, a world where adventure and discovery awaited us. For a few weeks, Josh slept over my house and we explored the new world. We would camp there for what seemed like days at a time. It was fun and downright addicting. Curiosity was what kept us going. We wanted to know more and more about the odd realm we had discovered. Here are just a few of the things we learned during our excursions. The lighting is fixed. It always looks to be about noon based on the objects and the buildings at eye level. However, the sky is black and filled with stars. It's a strange dissonance I can't quite put into words. It's impossible to phase through older buildings. Not sure why. There are no life forms, just as the book stated, not even animals or insects. Sound is bathed in a slight echo. It's always noticeable when Josh and I talk. It's possible to fall asleep there, but you won't dream. If you travel too far from your body, you'll hit an invisible wall and be unable to go any further. Time doesn't pass in the real world while you're departed. After about a month of successful departures, things changed. The more we explored, the more uncomfortable I felt. It always seemed like something was watching us, even though there was no one around. Josh was the opposite. Our late-night adventures were becoming so routine for him that he was becoming bored. He kept talking about the water and how he wanted to get a closer look at the pond near the main road. I reminded Josh of the author's warning, but it didn't seem to faze him. Eventually, his curiosity got the best of him. One night, upon leaving my body, Josh was nowhere to be found. I thought that maybe he hadn't departed yet, but up to that point, he had always beat me to the punch. This can only mean one thing. I phased through the walls of my home and raced to the nearby pond. Josh was there, standing at the end of the dock that locals use for fishing in the real world. I yelled out to him, "Josh, what are you doing?" "It's fine, see? There's nothing to be scared of. It's just water." I watched as Josh reached down and touched the surface of the pond. It rippled. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The water should not have reacted. We'd been there for weeks and hadn't seen a single thing move. Even the air was still. Perplexed, I began walking out towards Josh. He lifted his hands up, just as awestruck as I was. As he pulled his arm back, the ripple expanded. With it, a small portion of the water turned dark. After a few moments, something reached out from the blackness. It was a hand, an actual hand. It reached up and grabbed Josh's leg, yanking him downward. He went feet first into the water, holding on to the dock for dear life. As he screamed, I ran toward him. Before I could even get halfway to his position, I watched him disappear into the water. I ran the rest of the way, but the darkness had faded and returned to normal. My best friend was gone. In a state of fear-induced panic, I ran away. I wanted to save Josh, but I didn't know how. Plus, I felt that if I re-entered my body, perhaps I'd find him awake in the real world. It was wishful thinking, but it was all I had. That wishful thinking fell flat when I awoke. Josh was still unconscious. I tried and tried, but I couldn't wake him. Eventually, I called 911, and he was taken away on a stretcher. The doctors say he's in a coma, but can't discern what caused it. And that's everything. I'm a wreck over what happened. I've tried visiting Josh in the hospital, but I can't face his parents, and they're always there. Instead, I go out to the pond in the real world, hoping that somehow I'll find answers. All I do end up finding are more questions. They keep me up at night, along with the reoccurring nightmare replaying the events of that day. I tried departing since, but to no avail. Something's holding me back. It might be fear. That world is like a photograph, a still frame of a place we were never meant to see, a moment frozen in time with a layer of reality stripped away. And something is living there. Despite this truth, I feel a need to dive back in and save my friend. He didn't heed the author's warning, but I'm the reason he entered that world in the first place. I'm the reason he can't wake up. I have to go back. Hi, my name is Samuel, but you can call me Sam. I've been working the last couple of months as a web developer, and I recently had a decent raise. This will allow me to finally move out of my parents' house, in which the situation is just unbearable. However, it was difficult to find a house or apartment that didn't leave me drowned in debt. But suddenly, there was one that happened like it was just for me. A decent house, 2 floors and a backyard, for only $3,000. Yeah, this was a total fake or someone was pulling a prank, but I decided to give it a try. I was expecting some guy to answer the phone, giving the direction of the house in which we'd meet, and then just to find out it was a prank or something. Or maybe it was a scam and I was going to be robbed. But a woman answered the phone. I'll refer to her as Alex. I asked about the house I found on the webpage. She just gave me an address to go and talk about the house, said something about meeting me in person. I thought it was just a person selling their grandmother's house or something. Those people get kind of special about a place like that. Anyway, we agreed to meet at 3 p.m. Obviously, I checked the direction on Google Maps and found out it was an office building. The next day I took a bus to her office. It took me about 15 minutes to get there. As soon as I arrived, the guard told me where her office was. She received me and asked if I wanted something to drink, which I refused. I sat across her desk. Then she started asking questions about me, my work, family, etc. After a moment of silence, she sighed. Look, Sam, you're a good kid, but this house is not made for a person like you. I suggest you save your money and buy another house. What's the problem with this one? I asked. Well, it's what people would call a problematic house. By law, I'm forced to tell you what happened there, but it'll be better if I show you. She opened the drawer and took out a big folder, put it on the desk and slid it over to me. I opened it. Inside were documented police reports. Murders, missing people, and drug dealers were only the first 3 pages. Meanwhile, as I read the file, she started talking. The reason this is so cheap, it's because I just want to get rid of the place. I hope to call the attention of mobs or drug dealers just to use the place for money laundering. I can't even sell the house to any company for demolishing or building. It happens to be an antique house, so the government forbade me to do that. I won't stop you from buying it. I lost too many years of my life with that problem. If you want it after looking at that folder, that's entirely up to you. That really left me with a bad feeling. But the idea of spending another year with my parents was the only thing I needed to make the decision. So I accepted. For the next 2 weeks, we did all the paperwork and agreed to meet at the house. Alex refused to let me in before I signed, She told me that once I entered, that it was my problem. Finally, the day arrived. I met her at the house. She was sitting on the porch drinking a cup of coffee. "Well, Sam, here you have it." She extended me a folder. "Here are all the documents that state that this is now your property. Oh yeah, and the keys." "Thank you," I replied. "Guess I just need to buy some furniture now." "About that, most of the previous owners didn't change out the old furniture, so most of it's still in pretty good shape. But if you don't like anything, just throw the ones that aren't listed in the documents." She said goodbye and walked away, and I rushed to the door. Before I could stick the key into the locket, she screamed to me, "Oh, and you should sign one document in the folder." The inside of the house was dirty, years of accumulating dust in a very bad state, but the furniture was as good as new, just like Alex said. On the left side was the living room, with a large sofa and 2 single chairs around a table in front of the fireplace. Across was the dining room, a large 12-seat piece of wood with candlesticks. On the right side was the kitchen. It was big enough to have 10 people working on it at once. I sat down in one of the chairs in the living room. It was covered with a piece of cloth. Then, opened the folder and let the documents fall on the table. I quickly spotted the one she told me to sign. It was an old piece of paper, like the ones you see in old Western movies when the character has to sign a contract. I signed above the bottom line with my name on it. Below, under everything, there was an old folded piece of paper. I'll transcript what I remember. "Greetings. If you are reading this, it's because you are the new owner of the property. I'm sorry to tell you that this is not a welcome letter to tell you how great your life is going to be at this house. It is a guide to keep you alive in this place. This is a formality between the owners of this house. If you decide to sell it after handing this paper to the next owner, there are some rules you need to follow. The consequences of breaking these rules are high, but I assure you that if you follow them, then there's nothing to worry about. Rule number 1, the butler and the dog. This is more of a presentation than a rule. In the living room, you should find a silver bell. Ringing it will call the butler of the house. Refer to him as Mr. Bach. He will do anything you ask as long as it is related to house maintenance. He will not ask for any money. However, he might request an object every other month. Give it to him. Nothing bad will happen if you don't, but he will not attend your call again after that. On the other hand, the canine is a Saint Bernard. You may give it any name you want. Whisper and he will come to you. It is important that these two entities do not go along, and if I do get to choose which one, I'd choose the canine. Rule number 2, the guests. There is a chance that an unexpected guest may come to the house. You can open the door and talk to them. However, just let the ones pass that you expect to visit. If you break this rule, go out of the house and never return. Now it is under their control. Sometimes, you might find them already inside the house. You can also engage in conversation with them. If you want to end the talk, or if they just stare at you without blinking for more than a minute, call Mr. Bach and tell him that the guest may leave the house. Let him handle it and do not look. It can be disgusting. Rule number 3, the stairs. It takes 12 steps to get to the second floor. Keep that number in mind. If you count 14, keep going normally until 20, and then the 21st will be the second floor. However, if you do not reach it at that one, run. We have not to know the first person who can tell us what happened if that catches you. All we know is that it devours them. After 50 steps, you will find the second floor. Keep running through the hall and do not enter or look into the rooms. Jump at the end through the window. Rule number 4, the bathroom. It is in front of the main bedroom on the second floor. The one on the first floor is safe. Knock on the door every time you want to enter the room. If a lady named Madeline answers, wait 5 minutes and then enter normally. But if any male voice answers, call Mr. Bach. If no one answers, you may enter. Check the water in the sink. If the color is normal, do what you need. If red, break the mirror and open a little cut in your hand, then put it under the stream until it runs clear. If 1 minute passes and it's still red, leave the room and wait 1 hour and try again. If green, fill up the bathtub, immerse yourself completely and wait until it empties. Then you may proceed. Rule number 5, the basement. If any of your belongings are lost, you will find them in the basement. Do not go alone and without any light source. Call the dog. Once there, you will find a great dark spot on one of the walls. Order the dog to search your item in the dark and wait for him. If any other dog comes out, kill it immediately. If the canine does not come back in 5 minutes, go out of the basement and try again the next day. Do not worry about the dog. Rule number 6, the study room. The study room is the first door after the stairs on the second floor. Inside you will find a great library. Enjoy any book of your choice or use it as a workspace. If any of the books fall off of the shelf on its own, take it and read it until it closes by itself. Then put it back on the shelf. Do not refuse to read it. That it will take as an offense. Also, wear a watch with the current time and check the clock in the house to make sure your times match. Don't leave if they do not match. Rule number 7, the backyard. After 5 p.m., there is nothing happening in the backyard. You did not hear anything coming from the backyard. Rule number 8, the main bedroom. This is the only safe place on the second floor. Do not be outside of this room from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. If you happen to be outside, I hope they do not find you. Sleep with the dog if that helps. Rule number 9, the house. As long as your expected guests are on the first floor, they will not be in any danger at all. But get used to the fact that they forget about the dog or the butler. And last but not least, do not leave the house for more than a month. Sincerely, Arthur V. December of 1809. I read over these stories for some time, and I thought Alex did too, and she was just trying to make fun of me. This made me laugh and kept me entertained for some minutes. Anyway, I decided to explore the second floor to see what was there. It was great to have a new house. While going up, I took my phone and opened a chat with my best friend. We needed to throw a party. I was so distracted that it took me a few seconds to notice that I was supposed to reach the second floor some steps before. Then I felt it. The coldest breath at my nape. The walls started to rot, and I ran in a panic. I could hear how that thing was coming for me, how it knew that each step was more difficult than the other. After a minute of going up, I finally reached the second floor and kept running. My first thought was to enter a room, so I stopped at the first one on the left. The door was open. Inside was a man tied to an electric chair. He asked for help, but suddenly, the chair turned on, so I ran away. Those screams were not from any human. I felt like the hall was longer than normal, but when I finally reached the window, I jumped through it without thinking. For about 5 minutes, I fell through a void, where the sounds all faded away. Then I landed on the couch of the first floor. In a panic, I took the keys and left the house and ran home. Now I'm in my room at my parents' house. I tried to call Alex, but she didn't answer. Guys, I don't know what to do. The car accident was a blur, a symphony of shrapnel flying across the highway, the debris of at least 3 vehicles. At the time, I didn't know who was at fault or what exactly happened. I just knew pain, immense, searing pain, all over. I was in and out of consciousness for a while, but I can put together a picture of the following hours, however murky. The moments I do remember will forever be etched into my memory. I first came to on a gurney in the hospital, rushing through a brightly lit hallway. There was some chatter about my condition, but none of it was promising. A simple but ominous sentiment from a nurse stuck out like a sore thumb and stayed with me until I was sprawled out in the operating room. "This doesn't look good." Shaking on the table, I recall more bright lights, as well as the beeping of medical machinery on either side of me. Many doctors and nurses were at my side, scrambling to keep me alive. Though my mind was an utter mess, I do remember thinking that this was the end of my story. Between the intense injuries and the panicked doctors, I knew death was right around the corner, waiting to take me. My life didn't flash before me, and I didn't think of my loved ones left behind. There wasn't enough time for that. I simply succumbed to the endless slumber and closed my eyes as the flat line rang through the room. My eyes were fogged, but I could make out the shape of a tunnel ahead. At its end, a light. I made my way to it, cautious but curious. Eventually, I reached the glow and my vision returned. I was in a bright room. Before me, a tall older gentleman in a white robe standing at a podium. He beckoned for me to come over and spoke with enthusiasm. "Hello, newcomer. Welcome to heaven." He gestured toward the wall behind him. There were no pearly white gates, just a minimalist red door, void of any knobs or handles. "Heaven? So, I'm dead?" The man smiled. "Yes, indeed you are. But fret not, for this is heaven, a paradise of the afterlife. Would you like to enter?" I was disappointed that my life was over, but I knew it was inevitable, given the circumstances. At the very least, heaven was seemingly real, and I had been accepted. Yes, I would like to enter. I stepped forward, but the man placed his hand on my chest, stopping me. "Before you can enter the world above, an offering is required." I was confused. An offering? Of what sort? The man smiled again. "We need your skin." My face contorted in dismay. "My skin? But why?" "I can't provide specifics. Just know that it will be too cumbersome for you on your journey. Don't worry. The removal is a mostly harmless procedure." "Mostly?" The man removed a thin silver utensil from his robe and grabbed my forearm. He began carving, to which I pulled away. "I'm not removing your skin. That's above my pay grade. I'm just marking you for our records. I have to dig deep enough to engrave your muscle tissue. Please don't move." I reluctantly allowed him to continue. The pain was severe, but it was nothing compared to the injuries I sustained in the accident. When it was over, I looked down to see a string of unrecognizable characters, along with the numbers that made up my birthday, 0304, 1991. The man pushed the red door open and stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. I asked one more question before progressing. "Are you an angel?" The man pondered for a moment before replying. "I prefer celestial overseer, but if that term suits you, then yes, I am an angel." He motioned again for me to enter. Though not completely satisfied with his answer, I obliged. The door was swiftly shut behind me, leaving me to survey the area. It was a room, similar to the previous, only void of anything other than myself. I was confused as I walked to its center. Was heaven a plain white room? Was something supposed to happen? Just as I was about to go back to the red door, the unthinkable happened. I was launched upward at a great speed. If I had to guess, my velocity was akin to that of a meteor hurtling through deep space before meeting Earth's skies. In a matter of moments, I began burning up, a blue flame filling my field of view before turning orange, then red. As my speed increased, so too did the pain. It was like I was in the hospital again, dying of irreparable damage. What was happening? Was I reliving the pain of my death? My ascent continued, and with it, a deadly realization. I wasn't just burning. With great difficulty, I was able to tilt my head and gaze upon myself. My skin was peeling. I watched in horror as it left my body completely, slipping into the great white abyss below. All that was left was my muscle tissue. Soon after, the flame subsided, and my motion slowed. Steam surrounded me as I landed in a new location. Though experiencing an insurmountable burning sensation, I was still conscious and aware. Alive, if you could even call it that. It was hard to focus on anything but the sharp sting enveloping me, but I was able to comprehend my whereabouts. It was an endless white void. Within it, a plethora of bodies scattered about, skinless humanoid forms writhing in pain, covered only in red connective tissue, much like my own. They left blood trails as they crawled and slid across the white floor. My knees quickly gave out, and I too laid down in agony, unable to fight the anguish any longer. I desperately crawled to the nearest individual and spoke with what little energy I had left. What is this? Is this supposed to be heaven? Why did they take our skin? The grotesque red face of a person looked up at me and cried. They wear it. A shiver danced across the length of my spine. What? Who wears it? Before I could receive a response, an electric shock filled my body and jolted me awake. I was once again in the hospital on the operating table, somehow living, albeit barely. I tried to stay afloat, but I wound up drifting away into the bliss of a painless sleep. I awoke in a bed, bandaged up from head to toe. My injuries still stung, but not quite as much as before. A nurse assured me that I was okay, and very lucky to be alive. Recalling my experience and unable to see most of my body, I had to ask her, "My skin, do I still have my skin?" She chuckled. "Of course you do. Some of it will be scarred, but rest assured, it's still there." I sighed in relief, knowing my trip to heaven was just a strange, medicine and shock-induced nightmare. Thank goodness. It wasn't until a few weeks later, when I was finally able to go home, that I would discover something terrible about my wounds. I've told some about my near-death experience, but never the following, for fear of what conclusions might be drawn about my sanity. My first day back was peaceful. I relaxed and enjoyed my quaint life, happy it wasn't ripped away from me in an untimely manner. My next couple of nights, however, were anything but quaint. During my second night home, I woke up in a fit of sleep paralysis, my bedroom soaked in darkness and warmer than usual. There, standing at the foot of my bed, dimly lit by a sliver of moonlight coming through the window, was the tall man from heaven. His plain stoic expression was broken up only by the occasional grin, a malevolent smile that made my skin crawl beneath the blankets. The spike in adrenaline was not enough for me to break free of my chemical restraints. I was forced to endure his presence and watch in terror as he walked to my side and spoke. It wasn't always this way, you know. He was now close enough to me to feel an intense heat that his body seemed to give off. Heaven truly was a remarkable place, a world where mortals spent their afterlives in peace. The man grabbed my wrist. It burned, but I was unable to react. Thousands of years of routine breeds a fierce boredom. We were bored up there, never knowing what it was like where humans roamed. A need grew within us, a craving to explore the world outside of our realm. He picked off a piece of melted flesh and waved it under his nose like a glass of wine, inhaling the aroma. Our forms don't bode well in Earth's air. Your skin is the only thing that tempers the reaction. Otherwise, we would break down and disintegrate. He spread the piece of flesh onto his arms, creating a thin layer of protective paste. The heat dissipated. You've been marked. We need you back. We locked eyes, his head tilting slowly in observation as I futilely attempted to scream. His face lowered to meet mine. Tremors erupted throughout my body. Still, I couldn't move. Then suddenly, he vanished in a puff of smoke, leaving me alone in the darkness. Once the man disappeared, I was able to move again. I felt my wrist, and it was fine. No missing skin. However disturbing this incident was, I knew that it had to be a remnant of my dream from the hospital, a side effect of the trauma I suffered, nothing more than a reoccurring, albeit terrifying nightmare. Regardless of this explanation, I was unable to sleep until daybreak. The next night was stranger still. After brushing my teeth and looking up at the bathroom mirror, I saw something that shook me to my core. It was me, but without skin. A horrific amalgamation of red, muscly tendons made up my facial structure. Behind me, the tall man, his voice echoing off the bathroom walls. Come back to us. I fell back into the wall. The man was not there. When I looked at the mirror again, the sight was a normal one. I chalked this up to being another troubled facet of my psyche, post-car crash. It was clear at this point that I was severely troubled. I started entertaining the idea of seeking professional help in the form of a psychologist. The next night, however, disproved all previous theories about my bizarre state of affairs. Upon peeling back the bandages on my arm to bathe for the first time, I saw it. There were scars in odd, unrecognizable shapes, as well as a familiar numeric sequence. 03, 04, 1991. Business trips are dreadfully boring, especially in my line of work. The only good thing about them? Hotels. The tedium of day-to-day dealings bookended with clean towels and a mint on my pillow. If I could live in one, I surely would. There's just something in the ambiance that soothes my soul, for lack of a better phrase. At least, that's how I felt until staying at the Covenwood Inn. It seemed like any other hotel at first. Typical floor plan, decorative arrangements, overly polite check-in clerk. It wasn't until I received my key card and ventured up to room 371 that I would notice a dissonance in the layout. Something amiss that broke up the usual hotel landscape. In my room, placed deliberately on the bed, was a sheet of paper. Restrictions printed on official Covenwood Inn stationery. Room 371 rules. Rule number 1, no television after 9 p.m. Rule number 2, only accept incoming calls on the room phone. Rule number 3, leaving your room between the hours of 10:30 p.m. and 1:30 a.m. is strictly forbidden. Rule number 4, at least 2 to an elevator at a time. Never go in alone. Rule number 5, no visitors. If there's a knock at the door, ignore it. Rule number 6, the minibar is for emergencies only. Rule number 7, the view is a lie. Don't trust it. Enjoy your stay. This was odd. I had never seen anything like it, not once in any of the hotels I'd stayed at in the past. Perplexed, I called the front desk for answers. All rules are to be followed during your stay. The clerk stated this plainly, as if he had heard it uttered 1,000 times before. I don't understand. What emergency would warrant use for the minibar? Why can't I watch TV after 9? What does the view as a lie even mean? I was offered the same reply, spoken with the same tone as before, not unlike a recording. All rules are to be followed during your stay. And that was it. No answers, no explanation. Assuming it was some sort of strange hotel humor I was unfamiliar with, I threw the list on the bedside table and forgot all about it. Until later that night. As I laid in bed, watching the 10 o'clock news, something completely out of the ordinary happened. The reporter began scratching at her face, a little at first, but then a lot. Her motions became aggressive and skin began peeling. Blood dripped from the wounds as she continued to relay her report without missing a beat. No one seemed to notice or react to her appearance. Eventually, she froze in place and stared at the camera. Then, a close-up of her face, grotesque and mangled. Her bloodied lips spread apart and offered an ominous sentiment. "Don't break the rules, Jack." I jumped out of bed, left my room and ran downstairs. My voice echoed through the lobby as I barged over to the front desk. What the hell is going on here? The receptionist didn't so much as blink at my intrusion. "What can I help you with, sir?" I just watched a news reporter tear apart her own face and tell me personally, to follow your bizarre hotel rules. Is this some kind of sick joke? He pointed at the wall clock behind him. "It's 10:18, sir. In room 371. There's no television past." I grabbed him by the collar. "I don't appreciate being toyed with. Continue this jest and there will be a call made to the authorities. Mark my words." I let go of him and stormed off, his monotone voice trailing off in the distance. All rules are to be followed during your stay. I returned to my room, shut off the TV, and laid down to sleep, pissed off but exhausted. Unfortunately for me, my slumber would be short-lived. I awoke later that night in a fit of sleep paralysis, pinned in place by my own body. At the foot of my bed was a shadowy figure whose features I couldn't quite make out in the darkness. A warmth overtook the room as it stepped over to my side. My heart began to race. Closer now, I could see it was a man, maybe in his 50s, well-dressed, gray mustache. He leaned over me and spoke with a disturbing, unnatural timbre. His voice echoed off the walls and met my ear with an inhuman cadence. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Jack. Are you enjoying your stay so far?" I tried to break free of my chemical restraints, but it was no use. Where are my manners? I'm Garrett Covenwood, the owner of this here hotel. I like to greet my guests whenever I can. He rested his hands on my arm. There was a stinging sensation where his skin met mine, but I could barely wince in response to the pain. "Follow the rules, Jack. If you don't, You're in for a bumpy ride." All at once, the warmth dissipated, and the sound of my cell phone buzzing rendered me fully awake. I jolted to a sitting position, reclaiming my movement. The man was gone and my arm was fine. Thank God. It was just a nightmare. I quickly grabbed my phone and answered. It was my boss, Coulter. "Hey, Jack, there's been a change of plans. Need you down in the lobby right away." "What? What for?" I asked somewhat groggily. "No time to waste. Hurry up." I looked at the time. It was 12:36 a.m. I was forbidden to leave my room, according to the damned rules. I called the front desk. "Listen here, I need to come down to the lobby and meet my boss. I don't care what your rules say. There better be no weirdness. You hear me?" The sound of tapping away at a keyboard filled my ear. "Sir, our records show that your boss, Coulter Brumlock, is fast asleep in his room." Confusion washed over me. In his room asleep? How would you even know that? Are you telling me that there's no one in the lobby waiting for me? "No, sir. It's a slow night. Just me and the fern in the corner." I hung up the phone and dialed Coulter's number. After 2 tones, he picked up. "This better be good, Jack. I was sleeping." "Coulter, you didn't just call me a moment ago and ask me to meet you downstairs, did you?" He let out a groggy sigh. "Of course not. What are you talking about? Can I go back to bed now?" Another wave of confusion struck. "Sure, it was probably the wrong number or something. I'm sorry to wake you." Before hanging up, I asked him one last question. "Say, you didn't get a weird list of rules from your hotel, did you?" "No, now let me sleep." He hung up and I sat there, contemplating things. Honestly, I felt as though I was hanging on to my sanity by a single, fragile thread. I had told myself the images on the TV were the hotel's doing, but this couldn't be faked. Coulter and I had known each other for years. I knew his raspy voice anywhere, better than I knew my own. This was definitely him on the other line, but at the same time, it couldn't have been. It was, by all means, a mystery. The next day of work came and went. Before long, Coulter and I met back at the hotel where we were dispersed to our separate rooms. What was once the highlight of any given business trip was now tainted by uncertainty. For a good long while, I sat there in bed, still in my dress attire, pursuing the list of rules on the bedside table. I couldn't make sense of them any more than when I arrived, but it had become abundantly apparent that something was going on, something unexplainable. Part of me hoped it was the product of a tired mind, overworked and succumbing to the side effects of exhaustion. But lies, even the ones we tell ourselves, only stretch so far. After undressing and climbing beneath the sheets for some much-needed rest, there was a knock at the door. Rule number 5 came to mind. No visitors. If there's a knock at the door, ignore it. It felt silly, but I did as the rule demanded. Best to act with an air of caution, I thought. Better safe than sorry. The knocking, however, was soon followed by a voice. Coulter's voice. "Jack, are you in there? Your wife called me. Says she couldn't get through to you on your cell. Something's happened to Leslie." My heart sank. Leslie was our daughter. I jumped out of bed, ran to the door and opened it at once. Coulter walked in, visibly troubled. "What's going on? What happened to Leslie?" Coulter bore a look of deep concern. "Well, it's not good news." My heart was pounding. "Out with it already. What happened? This is my daughter we're talking about." He looked at me, almost teary-eyed. "Leslie's dead, Jack." All color vanished from the room. What air I had left my lungs in a single, labored breath as a steady stream of tears wet my face. Coulter put his hand on my shoulder. "There's more. Please, sit down." I fell to the bed, broken. "The truth is, Jack, you broke rule number 5. Now I have to hurt you." His lips stretched into a wicked grin and his body froze. He was as still as a statue. "Coulter, I don't understand." In a flash, his hands lunged and connected with my neck. With a viciously tight grip, he began squeezing the air out of my lungs. I tried to fight back, but his strength was overwhelming. I managed to get in a few jabs to his head, but it didn't seem to have any effect whatsoever. He forced me to the floor and continued to clench my throat, until finally, I lost consciousness. In that moment, I truly thought I was a goner. I awoke in bed the next morning, alive and well. I quickly reached for my phone and noticed a text from Charlotte. "Just put Leslie on the bus. She misses you terribly. So do I. Please be safe. We love you." I got out of bed and raced to the bathroom mirror. My neck was void of bruising, no signs of strangulation. I called Charlotte to be doubly certain. To my relief, Leslie was indeed fine, as alive as she was the day I left. It all just felt so real. Could it really have been a dream? Frazzled, I met up with Coulter and we drove to our next meeting. I could still see his hands wrapped around my neck. I refused to make eye contact with him the entire day, and he noticed. What could I say without sounding insane? "Hey, the hotel left me this weird list of rules to follow and now I think I'm seeing things. Want to stop for coffee before you drop me off at the nearest hospital?" No, that wouldn't bode well. Mild food poisoning from the sushi at the bar was a far better excuse. Only a few more days of torment, then I could leave. That's what I kept telling myself. Little did I know that my next night there would be the longest one yet. I awoke at 11:22 p.m., according to the blinking display of the alarm clock on the desk across the room. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed a faint, orange light dancing on the wall, pouring in through a gap in the curtains. I pulled myself out of bed and walked over to the window to identify the source of the light. What I saw was absolutely horrifying. The hotel was ablaze, an enormous fire engulfing the ground floor. The flames grew to great heights and touched the glass in front of me before I had the nerve to turn away and make a run for it. In leaving my room, I yelled to warn the other guests. "Fire! There's a fire! We need to leave at once!" No one joined me in the hall. There was no sound at all coming from within any of the rooms on the floor. Had everyone already evacuated? Was I the only one inside? I opened the first door in reach. It was unlocked. Inside was the reporter from the TV, her face still dripping red, a blood stain on the carpet below. "You should have followed the rules, Jack." I slammed the door shut and moved on. In the next room was Coulter. I watched him strangling a copy of me before his head turned and we locked eyes. He threw my lifeless body to the floor and started running to my position. "You can't hide, Jack." I closed the door and ran to the next. The room contained yet another impossibility. The worst one yet. It was my wife and daughter, standing at the door. Their eyes were vacant, drained of all human emotion. I watched astonished, as their skin burned to a crisp before my eyes. Charlotte spoke first. "We miss you terribly, Jack." Leslie chimed in after. "When will you be home, Daddy?" I couldn't escape them. These horrors were around every corner. In a last-ditch effort to run away from my troubles, I bolted to the nearby elevator. The button was jammed, but I kept pressing it. I looked down the hall to see the reporter, Coulter, my wife and daughter all walking towards me. Come on. Work, you piece of crap, work!" Finally, the button gave way and the doors opened. I hopped into the metal box and pushed the button for the first floor. The doors closed just as the ragtag team of zombies closed the gap between us. I slid to the floor, on the verge of a heart attack. The ride down offered no solace, no lull in the supernatural calamity I faced. Without warning, the elevator dropped, plunging to the depths of the hotel, far deeper than I thought possible. I gripped the railing as tight as I could, as the light wavered in and out of life. In between flickers, Garrett appeared before me. "You've broken almost every rule, Jack. This is what happens. You'll destroy us all if you're not careful." He vanished. The light left with him. Knowing my death was fast approaching, I closed my eyes and thought of Charlotte and Leslie. I could see them playing outside in the rain on the day I left. It was always heartbreaking to say goodbye, and this would be no different. I held on to their memory and braced for impact as the elevator neared the end of its descent. Garrett's booming voice entered my mind and broke the trance. "Wake up, Jack!" Jarred. My eyes opened and I fell back, landing on the floor. The unique abrasiveness of the carpet brushed against my skin. I was no longer in the elevator. Upon taking a deep breath and gathering my wits, the familiar surroundings set in. I had inexplicably been transported back to room 371. As I looked around in disbelief, happy to be alive, I noticed the list in my hand. Rule number 1 was now circled. "The view is a lie. Don't trust it." It took a minute to register, but I now know what it meant. The view through the window. There was never any fire. It was just another ploy to get me to leave the room, and I foolishly took the bait. My eyes darted to the alarm on the desk. It was 1:47 a.m., meaning it was now safe to leave. I needed to get the hell out of there, and fast. I stood up, marched to the door, and grabbed the knob. It was hot to the touch, burning hot. I pulled my hand back instinctively to avoid the harsh heat. I then noticed the charred wood on the bottom of the door's frame, indicating a fire. Real fire. But how? I thought the view had deceived me. I looked back to the list for answers and noticed a postscript scribbled in pen. "You should have followed the rules, Jack. You did this. Now we all have to suffer." My eyes scanned the page for more clues. To no avail. They kept landing on rule number 7. In addition to being circled, it was underlined with striking red ink. Why did my attention need to be drawn there? Was it just gloating? Or something more? That's when it hit me. I walked over to the window and peered outside. The fire raged outside my room, but the world below seemed unaffected. No flames, no firefighters, no one running out of the hotel. Just a plain parking lot, traffic on the main road, and trees in the distance. As normal a view one could hope to expect from this particular vantage point. But the view was a lie. I tried opening the window, but an unseen force closed it shut on my fingers. I screamed and pulled them back. In a great deal of agony, I lifted the chair at the desk and threw it against the wall. It shattered, revealing the world outside for what it really was. I saw the fiery wall below and heard the guests screaming in peril. There was indeed a fire, and I was truly in danger. Still in pain, I picked up the list and looked at Rule 6. The minibar is for emergencies only. This was certainly in an emergency. Without any time to waste, I opened up the minibar next to the desk. Inside were no drinks or food, only a small black box with a red button affixed to its surface. I pulled it out and placed it on the bed. There was now smoke seeping in the room through the outline of the doorway. Looking over the list again, there were no further instructions, nothing at all pertaining to the box. There was only one course of action left to take. I closed my eyes and pressed the button as hard as I could, putting my life in its hands. Memories played in my mind like like a film reel running in reverse. The day's events followed by the previous, and so on. I relived all of the fear and torment in a matter of seconds, until eventually, my eyes opened, and I found myself in line with Coulter at the front desk, waiting to check in. This place isn't too shabby, Jack. Better than the last one, at least. I can't explain how, but I was back in the hotel lobby on the first day of the business trip, the day we checked in. Say, Jack, what happened to your hands? I looked down and saw the bruises left by the window. Oh, it's nothing. Slammed them in the car door, that's all. Both of them? He was cut off by the check-in clerk greeting me. I was now at the front of the line. Do you have a reservation, sir? I stared at him for a while, remembering everything that had happened. I then backed away from the counter and turned to leave. Jack, where are you going? Sorry, Coulter. I think I'm gonna get an Airbnb instead. I'll see you tomorrow. He waved his arms at me, frustrated, and then backed to book his room. I heard the clerk handing him his key before I reached the exit. Here you are, sir. Room 371 on the second floor. We hope you enjoy your stay. Damn,